Welcome back to the Cruise Elite Podcast. Tony, what's up, man?
Good morning, Taylor.
Good news, there's no giant dump truck outside of my window this morning.
Oh. Yeah, we were talking about scheduling, and you were like, yeah, I think we take a break at noon. Maybe we can do that. So I'm glad. Is that over? Is that whole project over completely?
It's not completely over, but that was just kind of a fluke. They're building kind of around us some other units, and they seem to kind of do the work in waves. And there's like this giant dump truck that they keep nearby on this dirt road that we live on. And they finally got it started. It looks like it's been sitting there for a very long time. It had flat tires. There's like huge pieces of the truck missing. It looks like it's from like...
Oh, wow. So it was just like abandoned and left.
Yeah. And they basically got it running again with the sole purpose of just literally taking giant piles of dirt, like 100 yards. And they're building foundations right now. So yeah, that's why that was happening. I think that part of it's probably over.
Well, we'll see. We'll see what the next, the next thing is. Yeah. I'm excited to watch the cranial nerves masterclass.
Oh, yeah.
I signed up, but I wasn't able to participate on the day of. By the time this comes out, it probably won't be available anymore. But, you do this periodically where you'll have like a free masterclass.
Yep.
People can sign up for and watch. So I'm looking forward to checking that out.
It was good. It flowed nicely, and I'm getting a lot of feedback from people, and it was good.
Yeah.
And it was excited about it because we did it differently this time. So we had never actually done any cranial nerve type stuff in our master class before. So it was nice to have it well received.
Yeah. Part of why I want to definitely check it out is it's been coming up a lot in the past handful of episodes, the cranial nerves, like what they're responsible for, what they're connected to. And so, it's like, oh, that's good homework that I should be doing.
Yeah.
But another topic that's come up semi-frequently as of late has been related to the pelvic floor.
Right.
And you've mentioned it a few times, I think both like with yourself and like sacral tension and that kind of thing, but also with clients, some post-surgery, some not, where that can be like a huge focal point for you in terms of getting people back on track with their pain, with their mobility issues. And I'm going to plead ignorance. I don't know much at all about the pelvic floor, why it's important. So I thought it'd be great to just have a quick episode about it.
Yeah.
From your experience, give people kind of the basics and go from there.
Yeah, that's great. It is a topic that I think a lot of people would agree with you on. They feel like they don't know a lot about it. As far as, health and performance goes, the pelvic floor is not something that is discussed that much. It's definitely gaining popularity, but a lot of times you don't hear it mentioned, and a lot of people don't understand how it could be important for them anyway. Right. And as a movement coach, it matters a lot, but I think it's because it's the pelvic area, right? Like movement coaches just assume, oh, that's not really important for the work that I do. Or maybe I'm not allowed to do anything that involves the pelvic floor that's out of my scope or whatever. But for me, I'm looking at that and I'm like, well, it's just a set of muscles, right? It's just a set of muscles, and we can contract those muscles. We can relax those muscles. We can do things with the pelvic floor. And interestingly enough, there is a lot that you can do with it and a lot of reasons why you would want to target it. Gosh, we can talk about some of this stuff, but from a rehab perspective, there's a lot of reasons why somebody would want to go through a process of pelvic floor rehabilitation. But there's also reasons why training the pelvic floor could help, let's say, an athlete with performance, right? So you don't actually necessarily have to have some kind of dysfunction with the pelvic floor in order for this to be a good idea. So there's a lot of ways you can use it, right? And a lot of reasons.
Yeah. Maybe to kick things off, do you have like a particular story or scenario where a pelvic floor issue was really impacting someone's ability to perform or just in their day-to-day life, or
Mhm.
maybe where pelvic floor training ended up being the key to unlocking
Yeah.
someone's abilities?
Well, so oddly enough, like I think I'm the story, right? I really think that I'm a good example of this because, as I've mentioned in the past, I have a long history of sacro iliac dysfunction, starting back as long as I can really remember. Like it's beginning in youth sports when I played lacrosse.
Mm,
I actually have a memory of being laid up on the couch as maybe oh man, I had to have been maybe 10 or 12 years old, laid up on the couch with back pain. Literally, a back pain episode, can't walk. Like couple days, can't walk, that kind of thing, not able to go to practice. And when I think back to this, I had a lot of sacral iliac issues my whole life, and that kind of manifested into like sciatic like things that would symptoms that would come and go. And I never fully like solved a lot of that stuff for myself until I eventually learned about the pelvic floor and how it might be related.
mhm,
And so I'm the example because for me, I got myself to a place where I was pretty good. I was like maybe like 90%, let's call it. Mobility had improved, strength had improved, my pelvis was more stable. I wasn't getting like sciatic episodes anymore. But, and I think I told this story early on in a podcast episode, I did have an injury about 7 years ago, almost 7 years ago, that was a sacral injury. I dropped into it was pathetic, dude. I dropped into a body weight squat like really
mhm,
fast.
mhm,
And what I'm guessing is because I have always had, I guess, what I would call a pelvic torsion. So because the muscle tone differences in my pelvis, the structure is a bit asymmetric,
mhm,
which is fairly common. You could almost call it normal because we're not perfectly symmetric. But, you know, if it gets bad, right? If it gets to be too much and your nervous system perceives it as a threat, well, now you have an issue, right? So I had been building a lot of tension in my sacral area. I remember we had just moved to New Hampshire, and I remember doing a lot of hiking and being like, man, I'm starting to feel that tension that I don't like in my sacrum. And we were at a
Uh,
workout.
for
Yeah.
for myself, but for others too, the sacral area, could you define?
Yeah. So think about like SI joints. So you've got your big pelvic bones
Mhm,
that wrap around. If you put your hands on your like hip area, they wrap around. And if you take your thumbs and you bring your thumbs more towards the center, eventually your thumbs are going to fall into a little dimple like depression. Those are your SI joints. And so your pelvic bones and the sacrum, which is, in between those two spots, is what we're talking about for me. That's where I've
mhm,
I've held a lot of tension throughout my life. And, this is a joint structure, right? So it has to move, but you don't want it to move a lot.
mhm.
You don't want a pelvis that's super mobile, right? But there is some movement there and it has to be able to move. So that's the area that for me has been an issue for a long time. So I had dropped into a bodyweight squat during a workout and I already had some tension building in that area. And I felt like a zing and like a pop. And next
Mhm.
thing you know, I'm laying on the ground and
Oof.
telling Alicia to finish the workout without me. I'm just going to lay here for a while and see if I can get myself back up. And it was a dreadful injury. I was bedridden for
On
like
a body
almost a
weight
week
squat.
on a bodyweight
Jeez.
squat,
Yeah.
catching a tennis ball, dropping into a squat, catching a tennis ball. It's like a hand-eye coordination thing.
Mhm.
And the thing is, for me, it was a very stressful period for
Yep.
us. We had just closed our in-person studio in Massachusetts. We were essentially homeless for a little while, bouncing around. We finally moved to New Hampshire. I was very ungrounded.
Yeah, threat
And
bucket was
yeah,
way up.
you got it.
Yeah.
And what happens? Well, everyone has their thing, right? And for me, Like when my threat bucket is spilling over, it's likely that I'm going to feel that manifest as sacral tension. And I was kind of ignoring it, not doing what I should have been doing. And so, yeah, here I am with this injury, thinking, oh my gosh, I thought I had resolved all this, going through all that. Well, the rest of the story is I went through this whole process of retraining things, restoring movement. It was very challenging. And I got to a point where I felt like 95% better. And I started taking on more strength training and doing a lot more barbell work and heavily loaded things because my pelvis seemed like it was doing well in terms of alignment. I wasn't having any issues, but I just didn't feel as strong as I thought I should, particularly in like the bottom position of squats and stuff. And one winter, I generally get very bored in the winter. I'm like, okay, let's see how strong I can get. And I started doing a lot of like Zercher squats, which I really like Zercher squats. And I was like, all right, let's see how strong I can get with these. And I started noticing that I was entering kind of risky territory at the bottom of my Zercher squat because I could feel some tension building. Mm-hmm. So I sort of reevaluated and was like, you know what? I'm not 100% yet still after that injury. And for me, I think what had happened was my pelvic floor had become very tight, kind of in a compensatory way because of all the pain I was in and all the stability issues I was having. My pelvic floor kind of jumped in and those muscles became really tight as a way to try to help me. Mm-hmm. The problem is it went on for so long that I got to a point where that tone was still there, even though I felt like I was doing well. And that is risky, especially when you're going under load and you're expecting good coordination of a bilateral movement, like a Zercher squat. So I kind of put the brakes on and was like, all right, let me reevaluate. And I started doing some pelvic floor work. And I actually think that at the time I was inspired by, I was teaching the Neuro Dojo at the time, and we were basically getting into the pelvic floor section of the course because we go into that and we talk a lot about the insula cortex, and because the pelvic floor is related to it. And I was like, you know what? Like I need this stuff right now. And so I started doing some pelvic floor work, and it was phenomenal for me. I was able to get some really good results. I did it very consistently for about 4 to 5 months. And I noticed after about a week of doing pelvic floor work that my mobility in my hips and lower back felt so much better. And at the bottom of my squat, as I got back into my Zercher squats, I felt more symmetric, and I felt like I could really summon that kind of strength that I needed in the bottom position. So for me, it was huge at restoring symmetry in the pelvis and just giving me that, that next 5% that I feel like was missing from having gone through that whole sacral injury.
Mm-hmm. So before this episode, I just did a quick Google, and I was looking at, like common pelvic floor issues. And one of the ones that came up was hypertonicity.
Sure.
And that just sounds to me like what you described, where it just means the tone of the muscle was just it was over tight. It was too tense.
Yeah, that the resting tension in the muscles was too high. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of terminology that's thrown around with pelvic floor. And so, the pelvic floor, you will hear a couple of different things in the world of pelvic floor rehab and training. You can have a person that is struggling with that hypertonicity, that pelvic floor that doesn't want to relax appropriately. Mm-hmm. And then you can also have the exact opposite, where the pelvic floor muscles aren't functioning appropriately and people are missing the tone in the muscle that they actually need. And that might be like when someone complains of like incontinence as a history finding, where they don't have the muscular control to, let's say, stop themselves from peeing when they don't want to. See, we take all that for granted, right? But that's reflexive function.
So
right?
autonomic system.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So you don't really it's kind of based, it seems like it's based on extremes. You'll either have people that are too much tone or too little tone.
Mhm.
And there's different reasons why. For me, in my case, mine was probably because of a lot of protective tension that I needed because
Mhm.
of that sacral injury. So, yeah, that's typically what you hear. Now, see, the pelvic floor is tricky. It's there's a lot of muscles to the pelvic floor, and it's intimately connected to the intrinsic core. So your pelvic floor is constantly working in coordination with the diaphragm, which is your main muscle for breathing.
Also
So,
related to autonomic
yes,
function, right?
exactly, exactly. So you can't really separate entirely, the pelvic floor from, let's say, breathing and the diaphragm,
Mhm.
right? And actually, if you look at some of the connective tissue relationships, like the fascial tissue that runs through the body, the fascial connections, you can really trace them from like the endopelvic fascia, so the fascia in the pelvic bowl, to the viscera, right? So the connective tissues that surround your organs, to the whole thoracic cavity, and eventually up to the neck, particularly the anterior, the front portion of the neck and the throat, and
Interesting.
and even the tongue. So it's interesting to see those connections in terms of just fascial tissue, which means that you could, just based on that alone, you can at least theorize like, oh, okay, so could I affect a person's neck in the way the neck is moving, or maybe neck pain with pelvic floor work,
Mm.
right? And the answer is yeah, yeah, you could, and that's one reason why. So there's a lot of muscles involved in the pelvic floor. There's a lot of connective tissue that we need to know about for the pelvic floor. And here's what I've noticed over the years, just in talking to people about pelvic floor rehab that they've done. Because the pelvic, like people are not finding me for pelvic floor problems.
Mhm.
Like that's not what I do. I have had many clients over the years have gone through some level of pelvic floor rehabilitation because it was recommended to them for a number of different reasons. But people find me, for other stuff. But then based on history and assessments, I might use the pelvic floor as a way to affect other things, right? Whether we're working on stability or balance or strength or just decreasing pain.
Mhm.
The pelvic floor, or at least pelvic floor rehab, is generally not that successful. I think that there's definitely plenty of good practitioners out there that are doing good pelvic floor work. But the clients that I've worked with over the years that have done pelvic floor rehabilitation, it's not really that successful. And I think there's a number of reasons why. The pelvic floor can be very challenging to work with because it's incredibly reflexive. And everything that people do in a traditional rehabilitation setting for the pelvic floor is pretty voluntary.
Mhm.
So a lot of people will talk all the talk about the pelvic floor and go into all the little muscles involved and the connective tissues. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is like complicated stuff because it's a complicated part of the body. And then you get to the solution part and they're like, yeah, okay, now the solution, do some kegels,
Mhm.
which is like the contraction of the pelvic floor muscles. And it's like, well, wait, we know all this stuff about the muscles and the fascial tissue and the nerves and all this anatomy. And then the solution is one exercise that involves a voluntary contraction. And so people do pelvic floor rehab all the time and they do voluntary contraction of the pelvic floor. And it often doesn't get them very far. And the reason for that, this is what I'm getting at. The reason for that is because the pelvic floor, its function is so reflexive, meaning that it has control systems. So you can voluntarily contract it. And yes, that can help,
Mhm.
right? Those Kegel type exercises. but we have to know more about the neuroanatomy so that we can trace some of that stuff and understand what other parts of the body matter when we're working with the pelvic floor, but also what other parts of the brain that are involved in the contractions and coordination of those contractions. Because if we know how to target those things, we can put different inputs together, make the signal stronger, and start working at the pelvic floor at more of a reflexive way, I should say, versus only a voluntary one.
Yeah, this reminds me a lot of earlier conversations we've had where I guess you were talking about kind of like posture or other issues that people like to solve by strengthening the antagonistic muscle, right? So
Right.
like if you slouch a little bit, like, well, if you train your erectors, then it'll help you not slouch and
Right.
that'll solve your problem. And that all sounds good and that makes sense. But one of the things you were saying was, well, what if it's not actually the strength of the muscle that's the problem? It's the signal it's getting from the brain about
Right.
the tone.
That's right.
What if your brain thinks you're at a different angle than you really are? Or there's a million other theories we could come up with, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Is that a similar thought process here where instead of saying, hey, what you need to do is do essentially like a muscular workout for these contracting muscles,
Yeah,
maybe it's more about affecting the tone through other systems, through the autonomic system, through
definitely.
yeah, yeah,
Definitely. Yeah. So any midline structure of the body. So just anything right down the middle. So that could be the pelvic floor, it could be the diaphragm, it could be the eyes, it could be the inner ear. Anything in the middle of the body has the potential to be more challenging to work with and get results with because all of the midline structures are so tied into reflexive function and reflexive stabilization. So when you look at the pelvic floor, one of the reasons it's so tricky to work with is because you have right side pelvic floor muscles and you have left side pelvic floor muscles. It's not one muscle. It's
hmm
lots of muscles and you have right and left sides to those muscles. And if you have right and left sides to those muscles, you also have nerve innervation on the right side and the left side. And that means you have innervations at the spinal cord level, right and left side. And then if you keep going, you have right and left sides of the brain that are involved in coordinating all of this signaling and muscle contraction. So that's really challenging because a lot of times people have imbalance between different sides of the brain,
right,
which means you're now going to have an imbalance in the coordination of the contraction of muscles. So that's one of the reasons why it's so tricky. So we can't forget that, and we have to go higher order, right? We have to go higher order to deal with some of the reflexive function. And we can talk about some of those areas and things that matter too, so people can start to think, a little bit bigger in terms of how they might approach this.
yeah. You had said in your experience you had torsion, sacral torsion, right? So
Yeah,
a slight angle or asymmetry in how
that's right.
your pelvis was being held, essentially.
Exactly. Asymmetry. Yep.
Yeah. So based on what you just said, it might stand to follow that, like, hey, maybe if I affect the tone of one side, that's not quite, it doesn't have the correct tone, then maybe it could balance out that way. How
Definitely.
how would you start that process?
Okay. So let's begin with entry points for nerves that directly supply information to the pelvic floor. So before, like, kind of preceding any pelvic floor work, it's a really good idea to start with spinal mobility, right? Because of these nerves that come from the spine and eventually into the pelvic area. So the areas that are most important are T10 through L2. If you look at kind of the anatomy of this, T10 through L2, and also the sacral plexus S2 to S4. Okay, so the takeaway there is just move the spine, the lower thoracic, and the upper lumbar area. Like, that's really important. And you will find that a lot of people that have pelvic floor issues don't move well in those portions of their spine. Now, the sacral plexus is more challenging because, again, it's not so easy to mobilize the sacral plexus. Sure, you can do little subtle pelvic motions. Like, we have a whole series of joint mobility drills directed at the SI joints and the pelvis, and those are great. That's good. But with the sacral plexus, sometimes you have to get a little bit more technical and use muscle contraction in combination to mobilize those nerves. And here's actually a great, I'm excited about this one right now because it's something I've gone back to and it's super helpful for me. But we have an exercise. I know our listeners who are really studying this stuff and our students who have gone through our section in our courses based on neuromechanic drills will like this. So we have an exercise called a tibial nerve glide, or maybe what sometimes we refer to it as tibial nerve tensioner. And what you do is you might be in a seated position and you put your leg out in front of you straight and you extend your toes and you dorsiflex your ankle and you evert your ankle and you straighten your knee and then you lengthen up nice and tall and good posture, and you might hinge forward a little bit looking for the buildup of neural tension that kind of you might feel radiating down the leg. And once you feel that, it means that you have put mechanical tension on the sciatic nerve and the tibial branch. And we keep it gentle, 3 out of 10. You don't want that to be crazy intense. But once you're in that, because once you are tensioning the tibial area, you're now getting direct mechanical tension on the sacral area. And from there, you can contract, like tense your glute muscles voluntarily. And once you have the tension on the glute muscles, you do a forced exhalation. So you go, and you do this wheezy forced exhalation. And that combination of adding muscle tension through the contraction of your glutes, plus the forced exhalation, which is essentially putting more tension around the pelvic area by way of exhaling.
Yeah, your whole core kind of contracts.
Exactly.
You do that, right? Yeah.
That will put more tension on the sacral nerves. This one is like magic for me. It really helps me very quickly take away any unwanted sacral tension. And so that's an example of just getting creative and constructing the drill a little bit differently to put more emphasis on that sacral area, which might be really beneficial preceding any kind of pelvic floor work, because making sure that those nerves are healthy and can move well is very important, because for the pelvic floor, that's where a lot of that information is coming from. So that's like mobility, right?
Yeah.
Big takeaway there is spinal mobility, okay, and sacral mobility. Okay, and that's going to be that alone could be a very big upgrade to somebody's pelvic floor rehab or training. Okay.
I'm imagining someone that isn't very active or just hasn't done a lot of movement in those planes and in those areas.
Mm-hmm.
And just by mobilizing those joints and moving them around, it might connect some dots. It might clarify the map, right?
For sure. We got to make sure that information highway, those nerves are able to do their job and send info, accurately. Okay, so as we kind of start to look up from there, like kind of starting to think more higher order for some of these control systems, there are some areas of the brain that are very important to know about when you're training the pelvic floor. The first one that is super important is called the SMA, and it stands for supplementary motor area. And this is an area that is located in the frontal lobe. and it is responsible for helping us with very, call it anticipatory core control. Okay. What that means is that if our brain and body is working the way it's supposed to, before we move, like milliseconds before we move, we actually get what's called anticipatory stabilization to help stabilize us for the movement that we're about to do. And again, it's nothing that you are conscious of, right? This is a large part of like reflexive stabilization. So the SMA is involved in that anticipatory control. It is also highly involved in the coordination, not only stability, but the coordination of bilateral movements. So, why does this matter for the pelvic floor? Remember what we said, that the pelvic floor is tricky to work with because it has right side muscles and left side muscles that are innervated by different nerves, go to different sides of the spinal cord, and then are coordinated by different parts of the brain, different hemispheres. So the SMA becomes very important to us to ensure that we're getting, this is the key, bilaterally symmetric contractions. And a lot of times the people that have pelvic floor issues are not getting bilaterally symmetric contractions. We might have too much tone on one side, not enough tone on the other, whatever the case might be. So by activating the SMA in combination with some of these more traditional pelvic floor drills like contraction and relaxation drills, that alone can be super, super useful for helping to get more healthier contractions that are bilaterally symmetric. There's some bizarre ways to get more SMA activation. I'll throw a couple of quick ideas for people that want to play with this, but one of them that actually works really well is just bilateral complex types of movement. So if you look at some of our joint mobilizations, like hand figure eights, where we're controlling, we're creating some kind of, challenging, movement task with the hands, and it doesn't have to be the hands. It could be both knees, both feet, both wrists, elbows, whatever. But the key is bilateral. So you'd want to be coordinating that body part on both the right and left sides. What has been seen is that when you do some kind of bilateral, complex, nonlinear movement, you get more activation from the SMA.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the pelvic floor work that I do with somebody might look really weird if you've done only traditional style pelvic floor work where it's like all about a kegel. Well, I might have you doing bilateral hand figure eights at the same time as trying to coordinate a contraction with the pelvic floor, followed by a nice full relaxation. So that'll be one way to bring in more SMA activation. The other interesting way that also I've had good success with is vibration on the teeth. So I
wasn't
have this,
expecting that one.
Yeah, this is a weird. Yeah, this is weird. I have a device. I think I've probably talked about it before. It's called a Z-Vibe. And it is essentially a vibration device that's designed to go in the mouth for sensory reasons, for helping people with speech issues. So basically it's, a lot of people own a vibrating foam roller. This is a little vibrating pen looking thing, and you would do sensory work around the mouth and it can be quite useful. So we have this tool that allows us to also apply vibration to the teeth. Through fMRI studies, it had been found that vibrating the teeth actually increases activation and blood flow in both the SMA and also the insular cortex, which is very important for working with the pelvic floor too. We have a whole episode on the insular cortex and its importance, with how important it is for midline structures. We talked about the vagus nerve and all that. It's important here for the pelvic floor, mainly for autonomic reasons. But if you take this little vibrating tool and you put it on the teeth, particularly the front of the teeth. If you
Hmm.
were to bite it, you're going to get vibration on both the right and left sides. And so you're getting like bilateral stimulation to upregulate the SMA. That can be super useful for helping people generate more awareness around pelvic floor contraction and relaxation, which is really important because a lot of times people don't have good awareness of their pelvic floor.
Let's say someone does not have good awareness of the pelvic floor,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe you're trying to get them to do a contraction and they don't really know how to do that. I
Yep.
imagine that's something like how that might go.
Super common, more common with men.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And then you apply the stimulus, the Z vibe, to the front of the teeth
Yep.
bilaterally, and then have them test again, essentially.
Exactly.
Do you do it simultaneously or after, or?
Great. So, yeah, so you have a couple different options. You could apply the vibration to the teeth and you could keep it constant so that they were trying to do the pelvic floor work at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
That is absolutely an option. That's probably the one I use the most. You
Mm-hmm.
could have them vibrate. You could vibrate the teeth for, let's say, 20 seconds first, then follow up with pelvic floor contract relaxation drills with the reassessment being the awareness part.
How's your interoception?
Yeah. Do you feel like you are contracting those muscles better now? Do you feel like you're relaxing those muscles better now? So that would be like the part of the reassessment, in addition to like, okay, let's look at maybe low back mobility, pelvic mobility, hip
Mm-hmm.
mobility, if those things are important to us. Because remember, for me, again, people aren't coming to me because they have a pelvic floor problem. They're coming to me because they have a hip mobility problem.
Right.
I'm just using the pelvic floor to help them maybe with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so then we're rechecking with hip mobility as well, potentially. So, yeah, you got a couple different options there when you stack. And so, again, this would look very strange compared to a more traditional pelvic floor rehab, but I might have somebody doing bilateral hand figure eights with a little pen between their teeth, vibrating their teeth, and they're maybe to start laying on their back, with their feet elevated a little bit or something. And they're getting familiar now with good, solid, symmetric contractions of the pelvic floor, followed by relaxations.
Yeah.
One thing I should mention that I should have brought up earlier on is that the most people's experience with the pelvic floor has been based all around contraction, and the relaxation component of it is just as important, and for some people even more important. And the reason this is very important for people to know is that you really should assess what you're responding best to. So assess, how you respond to contracting the pelvic floor, but then also independently assess how you respond to relaxing it. A lot of times people have a very difficult time fully relaxing their pelvic floor. And what they don't realize is that it takes 2 to 3 times longer to consciously get those muscles to fully relax. So it's almost like people don't give themselves enough time to allow it to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be very boring. Like you're sitting there almost like you're watching the clock and it's like, okay, I'm trying to figure this out. I'm trying to get these muscles to relax. And if, you work with a client or something on this, all of a sudden it's like, oh, I think I just did what you said,
Hmm.
right? Like it literally can take a long time. And that's important to have that experience because when you are doing pelvic floor style drills, if you're contracting and you're not giving yourself enough time to relax, you are building tension as you go. And for some people, building tension as they go can eventually go badly wrong,
Right.
especially if you're already suffering from like high tone in the pelvic floor. For me, when I went through all my pelvic floor work, I had to put a lot of emphasis on the relaxation part. And really, what I learned is that in really focusing on that, I wasn't really able to relax, I guess what I would call more of like the posterior part of the pelvic floor. And so I had to put even more like energy and even visualization into that to figure out how to do it. So that's important. Assess how you do with the contraction, assess how you do with the relaxation, and realize that the relaxation part takes 2 to 3 times longer than the voluntary contraction, and allow yourself to go through that period of time no matter how long it takes to do that, to achieve it.
I I never think about the tone of my pelvic floor, right? So I can think about contractions, but for me, the relaxant would just be the absence of contraction, right? And that's not necessarily the same thing, right?
Right, right. Exactly. What you just said is how I thought, what I thought too.
Yeah.
I thought, okay, I'm not contracting anymore, so it must be relaxed.
Yeah.
But that's not the case. It actually, you got to really dial in your focus, and then all of a sudden you're like a minute or even 2 minutes later, you're like, oh, I think I just did it. It's really awkward at first. You're like, what am I waiting for here? And then, like, I've had many clients just be like, oh, that's what you
Interesting.
wanted. Like, it's challenging.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Would another entry point specifically for relaxing potentially be breathing?
Yeah, thank you for saying that. That's exactly right. So you don't want to leave out breathing from your pelvic floor work. It's quite important. A lot of the pelvic floor drills that we might do use breathing in combination with the pelvic floor contraction and relaxation. That's quite important. I particularly also like doing some mobilization work to the diaphragm in combination with pelvic floor work. For us, that usually looks like our famous diaphragm stretch that we love to teach people, where you're in different positions depending on what you're trying to achieve, and you essentially do a forced exhalation to mobilize the diaphragm. For some people, they might even need some more of like a passive technique there too. And there's some different kinds of like self mobilizations you can do on your diaphragm that are not too complicated, that just require taking your hands and placing them along the margin of your ribs with a little bit of pressure and
Hmm.
tractioning a certain way. And sometimes people do well with those too. But yes, that's a good point to make, that breathing in combination with this stuff is super important and can help you achieve that relaxation part better. All right. So, other areas of the brain, talking about these higher order systems that matter for pelvic floor work. We grazed over the insula, super important. The insula has a lot to do with the vagus nerve. The pelvic floor does not have direct vagus nerve innervation. However, the endopelvic fascia has autonomic innervation. And by working at the level of the insula, we can create some changes autonomically. And so, what we generally see is that these changes take longer to create, more time. So, working at the level of the insula through the pelvic floor drills we discussed, the breathing drills, potentially tactile, like manual work on the abdomen, thorax, vestibular inputs are really a big one for the insula. We talked a lot about this stuff in that insular podcast that we did. These are all really important things. And often what we see is the buildup of this kind of training, and it can take longer. And when I say longer, I actually mean still in the moment, but
Hmm.
maybe 10 minutes of work, 15 minutes of work, 20 minutes of work of repeated stimulation of some of these different things to create autonomic changes that can then be measured.
Right.
Whether you're measuring that with someone's breathing, the changes in mobility that we might get kind of locally at the spine and pelvic areas, that's what I mean. And that is a great thing to also involve in pelvic floor work. So the insula is a big one there, and you will be able to create some impressive changes in tone that you will see amazing changes for people in their hip mobility.
Hmm.
Like for people that have chronic hip mobility issues, chronic hamstring tension bilaterally. These are just some of the common things you see when people are struggling with their pelvic floor, and building up these different things for several minutes, at a time intensely. My goodness, you can see some really, really impressive changes in mobility.
Is the longer time due to the fact that you have a less direct path? Like you're
Yes,
going
that's
okay.
exactly right. That's exactly right. And yeah, because it's not like the vagus nerve runs directly to those muscles and supplies them,
Mhm.
right? So like direct vagal stim, like there's nothing there for us to work with, but it's the autonomic innervation to the fascial tissue of the pelvis that has the autonomic tone. So if we can change that, then we can also start to see some improvements in pelvic floor function.
And you mentioned this. This feels like an area where stacking might be more the norm than
Big
not,
time.
right?
Big time. Yeah, stacking vestibular inputs, stacking breathing inputs, stacking,
Mobility.
yeah, manual mobility, bilateral, complex movements like we discussed for the SMA. Stacking is the key here. And I think it's my belief that a lot of the reason people are not super successful with their pelvic floor rehab is because the stacking is not a part of it. Remember, the general pelvic floor rehab is just all about voluntary control.
Mhm.
Can you contract it? Can you relax it? And to give you an idea of how behind I feel people can be on this, a lot of times relaxation isn't even taught. It's just all
Mhm.
about the kegel.
Mhm.
Go do 500 kegels. Everything will be good. And there's a lot to it. All right. There's a lot to it, but besides that,
Mhm.
one other area worth talking about. Well, it there are a couple. There's several what are called micturition centers at the brain level, which I think is the fancy term for like urination, like the medical term for urination, if I'm not
Okay.
mistaken. And there's a micturition center in the frontal lobe. There's also one in the pons. The pons is part of the brainstem, and these areas would be very much involved in coordinating both contraction and relaxation involved in peeing. And the frontal lobe portion of this, or the frontal lobe micturition center, is more likely involved in inhibition related to this. So, like, I think back to my own history, right? When I was young, I had the bedwetting issue,
Mm.
right? I could not inhibit well enough. I had a whole pile of frontal lobe issues growing up, and I could not inhibit well enough to stop myself from peeing at night. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about when I say inhibition. The
Mhm.
frontal lobe is involved in lots of different kinds of inhibition. This is one of them related to peeing. And there's another one of these micturition centers in the pons. Okay, remember our brainstem? We've got the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And the one at the level of the pons, I believe, is more involved in initiating
Mhm.
going to the bathroom or peeing. So knowing this neurology can also be useful because we could potentially use frontal lobe activation or pontine activation, and we know how to directly target this area, the pons,
Mhm.
to possibly help with also coordination of the muscles at the pelvic floor. So just kind of another example of some of this neuroanatomy and how going after some of these things through the different tool sets that we have could possibly help someone gain more control over their pelvic floor, but better reflexive function.
Mhm.
That's the key. That's the takeaway. So it's just neat because as we talk about all the time, for example, knowing that it might be useful to activate the pons, well, then you go, okay, how do I do that? You reach into your toolbox and you go, oh my gosh, I can do that so many different ways. I can do that through the eyes, through the inner
Mhm.
ear, through direct activation of cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8. Now I can do sound stimulus, vestibular stimulus, facial muscle stimulus, jaw muscle stimulus, vibration on the face, like all of these things that are associated with a particular cranial nerve that originates at the level of the pons are now in play as a stacking tool
Mm-hmm.
for helping with something that seems not related, like the pelvic floor, but actually is when you look at the neuroanatomy.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I love looking at this stuff and the pathways and, just getting creative and trying to figure out, all right, can we use this? Can we use that? With the end goal of, something like better contraction of a group of muscles.
Yeah, that's fascinating. People aren't coming to you because they have pelvic floor issues, but
Right.
that might come up in a history finding. It might take a while to come up, right? But you might hear like, oh yeah, like I have, I always have to pee or something. I always have to
Yeah.
go. And that might be like a clue, right?
Totally. In some clients too, depending, they'll tell you if they have, bladder issues and stuff that can come up, for sure. There's lots of reasons, like little history items that, would be important. Any kind of midline stability issues, chronic hip mobility issues. I think I mentioned bilateral hamstring tension that's chronic. Gosh, even sensory issues like sensory issues in the feet. Because if your pelvic floor is dysfunctional and there's a lot of compression being put on nerve roots at the level of the sacrum, you could literally have problems with your feet, whether they're motor problems, sensory problems. It's really interesting. So pelvic floor work could help with that kind of a thing too. And then also clients will tell you about like incontinence sometimes if it's like an issue for them, because like some people will exercise and then they can't control themselves. And, you often will hear people talk about this, like when somebody's jump roping or deadlifting, a little bit more common in the female population where they might pee, accidentally while performing an activity that requires a great deal of midline stabilization and bilateral coordination of right and left muscles of the pelvic floor. So you'll see that too. Other history items that matter, well, birth. If you give birth, well, you've had a pelvic injury, right? And sometimes there's tearing, right? To different layers of the muscles that exist at the pelvic floor. There's 3 different layers: a superficial layer, a mid layer, and a deep layer, right? And so birth is one. C-sections, if you've had an abdominal surgery like that can certainly impact pelvic floor function. It can impact breathing. Sacroiliac dysfunction, any kind of hip and pelvic pain, you'd want to be thinking about the pelvic floor. And athletic injuries like trauma, right? I mean, gosh, I think about growing up skateboarding. Do you know how many times I straddled a skateboard? And I'm not talking about getting hit in the jewels. I'm talking about the blade of the skateboard, like literally piercing you between the legs. Like I remember that happening. But gosh, as a wrestler and jujitsu guy, man, sometimes you get nailed between the legs. Direct trauma to the pelvic floor can matter too, especially if that's happened, many times in an athletic career. There's a lot of little things that, you might think about when you're going through history with people.
Yeah. We're running short on time here. I do feel like this is a great primer of just all of the different symptoms to look for that could direct you to the pelvic floor.
For sure.
And then access points to then help strengthen or provide the correct tone. Strengthen isn't necessarily the goal, right? Provide the correct tone to the pelvic floor muscles.
Exactly.
Yeah. Is there anything else before we wrap up that you got to leave us with?
Well, I think it's just kind of more important to summarize briefly, because what I'm really hoping that people can get out of this episode, because anyone who's going to listen to this is going to have a direct, like they're going to be very interested in the pelvic floor. Okay. And for good reason, right? There's a lot of people who are in need of pelvic floor rehab and training. The main takeaway that I'm hoping people can get from this episode is the reflexive function part, where we have to go further than just the contraction, than the, Kegel exercise. So to summarize, contract and relax. That's where it begins. Make sure you give yourself appropriate time to relax and assess. How are you responding from each one of those things? You can test them independently just using range of motion or levels of pain, right? And that's going to be important because you might find that one is better for you than the other right now. So that's the first thing. The second thing was spinal mobility, right? Going after the lower thoracic and upper lumbar spine, but also the sacral nerve root areas by way of thoracic mobility, lumbar mobility, pelvic mobility, and then even some of our neuromechanic drills, namely that tibial nerve glide, could be quite useful there with the additional muscular tension of the glute tissue, the contraction of the glutes. Those would be wonderful things to try in addition. From there, as we go higher order, consider the bilateral complex nonlinear movements. You can use any of our complex joint mobilizations for this. Hand figure eights, wrist circles, elbow circles, knee circles, whatever the case might be. Just try doing a movement, the same movement on the right and left sides of your body, and see if that helps you coordinate the pelvic floor contraction better. That would be a huge one. And then finally, if you want to keep going and really explore things, the vestibular inputs, huge. I don't think I mentioned it, but you can hear more about this in the interoceptive podcast we have or the vagus nerve podcast we have. The tongue. The tongue is also a structure. We have exercises for the tongue that could be very useful in addition to the vibration I mentioned on the teeth. All those things, just money. I mean, very, very useful ideas that can help you bring your pelvic floor work to the next level, looking at it through more of a neurocentric lens.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
All right, there it is. I hope that was helpful and gave you a little insight into how we might look at pelvic floor rehab and training differently, going beyond just the popular Kegel exercise. Make sure that you give us a review. This podcast now is it's getting good, guys. Like, we're really enjoying doing these episodes for you. I'm getting a lot of feedback. We really appreciate your support. What we're in need of right now is some of those reviews, and it really helps us out. So if you'd be so kind to make sure you do that for us, and don't forget that I'm also putting a lot of time into the YouTube channel right now. So definitely head on over there. And I'd love to hear from you to know what kind of content you're actually looking for on the YouTube channel. It's great to hear from you. It's great to help you out. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back soon.